Betrayal, they tell you, arrives like a thunderclap, a dramatic, crashing crescendo of yelling, accusations, and broken furniture. They're wrong. For me, betrayal arrived on a Tuesday night, not with a bang, but with a whisper. It came quietly, wrapped in the civilized hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of wine glasses. It was a subtle, surgical strike to the heart, far more devastating than any shouting match could ever be. It started, as most disasters do, with an illusion of normalcy. Carla, a friend from the periphery of our social circle, had just finished a gut renovation of her sprawling suburban home and was throwing a housewarming party to celebrate. Elena, my wife, was ecstatic. The prospect of a new, beautifully decorated space to conquer socially was, for her, the equivalent of an Olympic event. She spent the entire afternoon in a flurry of preparation. Hair, makeup, the perfect dress, a strategic campaign of self-perfection. I didn't think much of it. Elena had always liked to make an impression. It was part of her charm, part of the high-wattage energy that had drawn me to her in the first place. But looking back, I can see it now. There was a different quality to her energy that night. Not just excitement, but a kind of brittle, high-strung anticipation. A warrior preparing for battle. When we arrived, the house was already buzzing, a hive of ambition and expensive perfume. Carla had gone all out. Catered food, a makeshift dance floor in the den, even a DJ in the corner playing a monotonous, soulless brand of electronic music. Elena, in her element, dove into the crowd immediately, a social heat-seeking missile, greeting everyone with a warmth and enthusiasm that felt, to my increasingly cynical eyes, a little too practiced. I retreated to the edges, as I always did at these events. I was the quiet, steady planet to her dazzling, chaotic sun. I nursed a beer and found refuge in a conversation with David, a friend of ours who worked in finance, and shared my general disdain for this kind of performative socializing. And that's when I saw him. Jason, a name I hadn't thought about in over a decade, but a face I recognized instantly. The same arrogant smirk, the same easy, predatory confidence. He had been my college roommate for one disastrous semester before I had requested a transfer, unable to tolerate his relentless, exhausting need to one-up everyone in his orbit. I hadn't seen him since, and the world had been a better place for it. But here he was, in the middle of Carla's living room, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, and somehow, effortlessly, commanding the room's attention. I didn't think much of it at first. A bad memory from the past, an unwelcome ghost at the feast. But then, I noticed who he was talking to. Elena. She was laughing, that loud, unrestrained, head-thrown-back laugh she used to reserve for me. She was leaning in close as he spoke, her hand resting, for a fraction of a second too long, on his forearm. I told myself it was nothing. Elena was a social butterfly. She flirted with everyone. It was her nature, her currency. But as the night wore on, a cold, hard knot began to form in my stomach. She wasn't just talking to him. She was staying near him, orbiting him, a satellite caught in the gravitational pull of a new, brighter star. I kept my distance. I refused to be that guy, the hovering, insecure husband who gets territorial at a party. So I let it go. I nursed my beer until it was warm and flat, and I talked to David about the stock market, all the while a part of my brain was tracking their movements, a silent, internal radar system on high alert. And then, it happened. The moment the quiet betrayal became a public execution, Carla called everyone into the living room for a toast. We all gathered, a murmuring, smiling crowd, glasses raised. She thanked us for coming, made a few jokes about the nightmare of living through a renovation. And then Jason, ever the showman, ever the spotlight thief, couldn't resist chiming in. He cracked a joke, something forgettable and crass, but it landed. The whole room laughed. Elena laughed the loudest. Her eyes were sparkling as she glanced at him, a look of pure, unadulterated adoration on her face. And then, right there, in front of me, in front of our friends, in front of God and everyone, she leaned over and kissed him. It wasn't a quick, friendly peck on the cheek. It was on the lips. It was deliberate. It was slow enough for everyone to see. The room went silent for a single, stunned, heart-stopping beat. And then, the laughter picked up again, but it was different now. It was awkward, scattered, the sound of people trying desperately to pretend they hadn't seen what they had just seen. But the worst part wasn't the kiss. The worst part was what she said immediately after. As she pulled away from him, her hand still on his arm, she turned her head slightly, and in a voice loud enough for everyone in our immediate vicinity to hear, she announced, a triumphant, beaming smile on her face. "Now that's a real man." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The room began to spin. The chatter, the music, the laughter, it all faded into a roaring, white noise in my ears. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, a statue of public humiliation. I don't know how long I stood there. A few seconds? A few minutes? It felt like a lifetime. Eventually, the moment passed. The chatter resumed. People went back to their drinks, to their conversations, to the collective, unspoken agreement to ignore the grenade that had just gone off in the middle of the room. Elena didn't even glance in my direction. She turned back to Jason, laughing at something else he said, her hand still resting, with a casual, proprietary intimacy, on his arm. I wanted to leave. I wanted to grab my coat, walk out that door, and never look back. But I didn't. I stayed. My fists were clenched at my sides. My jaw was a knot of solid, aching muscle. I was waiting for the moment I could get her alone. I would not cause a scene. Not here. Not in front of them. But I would not let this slide. When the room finally began to clear out, I made my move. I walked over to her, my voice a low, dangerously calm thing. "We need to talk." She looked at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, a fleeting, treacherous moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. But then, it was gone, replaced by a small, infuriating smirk. "Sure," she said, her tone light, casual, as if I were suggesting we discuss what to have for dinner tomorrow. I waited until we were alone, until the last of our so-called friends had trickled out the door, their awkward goodbyes hanging in the air. Then, and only then, did I let her see the storm that was brewing inside me. Because if she wanted to see what a real man looked like, I was about to give her a full and unforgettable demonstration. The drive home was a study in weaponized silence. The air in the car was thick, unbreathable, a toxic miasma of unspoken rage and unacknowledged betrayal. Elena sat in the passenger seat, the blue-white glow of her phone screen illuminating her face, creating a stark, alien mask. She was scrolling through her social media feed, a casual, almost defiant act of normalcy in the face of the cataclysm she had just unleashed. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were bone white. I couldn't speak. Not yet. The words were there, a seething, volcanic mass in my chest, but I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, they would erupt with a force that would incinerate us both. When we pulled into our driveway, she didn't wait. She grabbed her purse, opened the door, and headed inside, leaving me alone in the idling car, staring at the darkened windows of the home we had built together. I sat there for a long time, the engine a low, steady hum, trying to get the storm inside me under control. My thoughts were a chaotic, tangled mess of anger, humiliation, and something else, something sharper and more painful that I didn't want to name. Hurt. Eventually, I killed the engine and went inside. She was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine, her heels already kicked off by the door. She moved with an air of breezy indifference, as if she had just returned from a pleasant, uneventful evening out. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge me, to acknowledge the gaping, bleeding wound she had just inflicted on our marriage. She didn't. Instead, she glanced up, her expression one of mild, bored annoyance. "Are you going to keep sulking in the doorway, or are we going to talk about it?" My jaw tightened. Sulking. That's what she called the profound, tectonic shock of her public betrayal. "You kissed him," I said, my voice low, careful, each word a carefully placed stone in the dam I was trying to build against my own rage. "In front of everyone." She shrugged, a gesture of such profound, breathtaking indifference that it almost made me laugh. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. "It was a joke, Mark. Don't be so dramatic." "A joke," I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts. "You called him a real man in front of all of our friends. You think that's funny?" She rolled her eyes, setting the glass down on the counter with a sharp, impatient clink. "You're overreacting. Jason's just a friend. It didn't mean anything." I stared at her, searching her face for a single, solitary flicker of remorse, of empathy, of basic human decency. There was none. "You humiliated me," I said quietly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Do you have any idea how that felt?" She sighed, a long, exasperated sound, and leaned back against the counter, as if my pain was a tedious inconvenience she was being forced to endure. "Mark, you're being ridiculous. No one cares about that kind of stuff except you. Everyone else probably forgot about it 5 minutes later." "That doesn't make it okay," I snapped, my voice finally breaking free of its restraint. "You didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected our marriage. Do you even care about that anymore?" She flinched at that, but only for a second. The familiar, defensive mask slammed back into place. Her expression hardened. She crossed her arms over her chest. "Maybe if you acted more like a husband and less like a roommate, I wouldn't have to joke around like that." Her words were a slap, a stunning, brutal blow that left me breathless. I had always known there were problems, unspoken tensions that had been simmering for years. But to hear her say it like that, to use it as a weapon, as a justification for her cruelty, it was devastating. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, my voice quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. "It means I'm tired, Mark," she said, her own voice rising now, her frustration finally boiling over. "I'm tired of the silence. I'm tired of feeling like I'm the only one trying in this marriage. You go to work, you come home, you sit on the couch. Where's the passion? Where's the ambition? Where's the man I married?" I stared at her, stunned. "So, kissing Jason, that was your way of fixing that? Of reigniting the spark?" "It was a mistake, okay?" she snapped, throwing her hands up in the air. "I was trying to get your attention, and clearly it worked." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her how twisted, how insane, how deeply wrong she was. But I stopped. What was the point? She wasn't listening. She didn't care. I could feel it in the cold, dismissive way she looked at me. I was losing a battle she had declared over long before I even knew we were at war. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen. I went to our bedroom, shut the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. The silence of the house was heavier now, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I thought about what she'd said. Asterisk lack of passion, lack of ambition. Asterisk was she right? Had I become that man? Or was this just a story she was telling herself to justify her own betrayal? I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that something had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted between us. For years, I had tried to be the steady one, the reliable one, the man who provided, who supported, who stayed. And now, it seemed, none of that mattered. As I sat there in the dark, a cold, hard resolve began to form in the wreckage of my heart. I was not going to yell. I was not going to beg. I was not going to let her break me. If Elena wanted to see what a real man looked like, then fine. I would show her, but not in the way she expected. Because true power isn't about making the most noise. It's about knowing when to be silent. And in that silence, I began to form a plan. A way to take back control. A way to remind her, and myself, of who I really was. The days after the party were a masterclass in psychological warfare, and I was the unwilling conscript. The humiliation of that night didn't just fade. It lingered, a toxic, radioactive fallout that contaminated every aspect of my life. Elena might have shrugged it off as a joke, but our friends, that gossiping, piranha-like school of socialites, were not going to let it go so easily. My marriage had just become their new favorite blood sport. It started, as these things do, with a text message. It was Monday morning. I was at my desk, trying to force my brain to focus on a complex legal brief, when my phone buzzed. It was from David, my closest. Or so I had thought, friend in the group. "Hey man, how are you holding up?" Asterisk. No context. No preamble. Just a direct, pitying inquiry that told me everything I needed to know. I stared at the message, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. "I'm fine." "Why?" Asterisk I typed back, a pathetic, transparent lie. His response was immediate. Asterisk you know why? Carla told me everything. Call me if you need to talk. Asterisk. Carla. Of course. Her inability to keep a secret was legendary. If she had told David, she had told everyone. And sure enough, the group chat, a digital snake pit I usually kept muted, lit up that afternoon. Vague, awkward messages, transparently fishing for a reaction. "Hey Mark, Great seeing you at the party. Asterisk. That housewarming was eventful. Huh. Asterisk. Hope you and Elena are doing okay. Asterisk. I didn't reply. What could I say? Asterisk yes. My wife kissed my old college nemesis in front of all of you, and then called him a real man. My life is a raging dumpster fire. How was your weekend? Asterisk silence felt safer. But the silence didn't last. On Tuesday, I had the misfortune of running into Carla at the grocery store. She was in her natural habitat, flitting down the aisle, tossing expensive, organic produce into her cart. When she spotted me, her face lit up with a look of predatory glee disguised as concern. Mark. Oh my gosh. I've been meaning to call you, she gushed, her voice a weapon of syrupy sweetness. How are you doing? After you know. I wanted to tell her to mind her own damn business. Instead, I forced a smile that felt like it was cracking my face. I'm fine, Carla. Thanks for asking. She tilted her head, studying me like a particularly fascinating insect specimen. You don't look fine. I mean, I can't even imagine how I'd feel if... She stopped herself, probably realizing she was about to say too much. I just mean, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. Thanks, Carla, I said tightly, grabbing a loaf of bread and trying to make my escape. But she was undeterred. Honestly, though, she continued, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, Elena must have had too much to drink. She probably didn't even realize what she was doing. You know how she gets at parties. I stopped and turned to face her, my patience finally worn thin. Carla, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I appreciate your concern. But this is between Elena and me. Let's leave it at that. She blinked, momentarily caught off guard by my tone. Of course, Mark. I didn't mean to overstep. But she had. And we both knew it. That encounter was just the beginning. I started to notice the subtle shifts in everyone's behavior. David, usually so direct, was now hesitant, awkward. Sophia, one of Elena's closest friends, went out of her way to defend her every chance she got. She didn't mean anything by it. Mark, she'd say. Jason is just charming. Elena was probably just caught up in the moment. She kissed him, Sophia. I'd reply, my voice a flat, dead thing. That's not a moment. That's a choice. And then there was Jason. I ran into him at a coffee shop downtown a few days later. He was sitting at a corner table, looking as smug and self-satisfied as ever. When he saw me, he had the audacity to wave me over. Mark, what a surprise, he said, leaning back in his chair. I was just thinking about you. Were you? I said, not moving to sit. Of course, he said with that infuriating grin. Hope there are no hard feelings about the other night. You know Elena. Always the life of the party. She's my wife, I said, my voice even, my eyes locked on his. Not your entertainment. His grin faltered for a split second. Hey, no disrespect, man. Just having a little fun. Good, I said, my voice dropping. Because if it happens again, you'll regret it. His smile disappeared completely. I turned and walked out of the cafe, my heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and a new, unfamiliar sense of power. I hadn't planned to say that, but it felt good. It felt necessary. But the truth was, the damage was done. My so-called friends had seen the cracks in my marriage, and Jason had seen an opportunity to drive a wedge into them. And Elena? She was moving through her days as if she were a tourist in the wreckage she had created, utterly oblivious to the storm. But something had happened, and I was not going to let it go. Not this time. By the time the dust from the party and its immediate, toxic aftermath began to settle, I knew one thing with an unshakable certainty. I could not continue to live in a state of passive, simmering resentment. Stewing in my own humiliation was not a strategy. It was a surrender. If I wanted to take back control of my life, I had to act. The first step was a quiet, almost revolutionary act of self-preservation. I needed help. Not from our nosy, judgmental friends, but from someone objective, someone who could help me untangle the chaotic knot of anger, hurt, and self-doubt that had taken up residence in my chest. That's when I thought of Rachel. Rachel and I had been close friends years ago, before Elena, before this life. She was a therapist, sharp, empathetic, and blessedly, completely outside of our social circle. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I called her, my voice a little too tight, and explained the situation in broad, clinical strokes, she didn't hesitate. Sitting across from her in a quiet, sunlit coffee shop, it felt strange to be so vulnerable. I wasn't used to it. But Rachel had a way of listening that made it easy. I spilled everything. The party, the kiss, the real man comment, the fallout with our friends, my own crippling doubts about whether Elena's accusations about me, that I was passionless, ambitionless, were true. When I finished, she leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Mark," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It sounds like you've spent so many years being the stable, reliable one. The rock, that you've forgotten that rocks can erode, too. You've been holding everything together, and you've forgotten to take care of yourself." Her words hit me with the force of a revelation. She was right. For years, my identity had been subsumed by my role as a husband, as a provider. I had lost sight of the man I was outside of that context. "What do I do?" I asked, the question a raw, honest plea. Rachel smiled. "You start by finding yourself again. What makes you happy, Mark? What gives you a sense of purpose? You need to reconnect with that man before you can even begin to decide what to do about Elena." Her advice became my new blueprint. For the first time in a long time, I started to think about what I wanted. I began to make small, deliberate changes. I started going to the gym after work, something I hadn't done since my 20s. At first, it was awkward. I felt old, out of shape. But after a few weeks, I began to feel a change. Not just in my body, but in my mind. There was a clean, satisfying clarity that came from pushing myself, from setting a goal and meeting it. It was a reminder of my own capability. I started to focus on my career with a new, ferocious intensity. For years, I had been content in my senior associate position at the law firm, a steady, respectable, but ultimately uninspiring role. Now, I began to look for opportunities to grow. I volunteered for challenging cases. I started networking with partners I had barely spoken to before. I began to remember that I was not just a competent lawyer, I was a damn good one. But the most significant change was at home. I stopped engaging with Elena's drama. When she'd make a snide, passive-aggressive comment, I wouldn't bite. When she'd try to bait me into an argument, I would calmly walk away. It wasn't about ignoring her. It was about refusing to let her control my emotional state. And slowly, I noticed a shift in her. My newfound calm, my disengagement from our toxic dance, seemed to unsettle her. She wasn't used to me being so in control. "You've been different lately," she said one evening, her voice cautious. I looked up from the legal brief I was reading. "Yeah," I said, my tone casual. "I guess I have." She frowned, clearly expecting more. "Is it because of the party? Are you still mad?" I closed the brief and set it aside. I met her gaze. "I'm not mad, Elena. I'm just done. Done letting other people, you, our friends, anyone, define who I am." Her eyes widened slightly. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine doubt in her expression, a crack in the armor of her self-righteousness. But I wasn't finished. I had one more piece of my plan to put into place, and it involved Jason. The smug, self-satisfied look on his face that night had been eating at me. I couldn't move forward until I had dealt with him. It started with some quiet digging. Nothing illegal, nothing invasive. Just a few discreet inquiries with old contacts, a deep dive into public records. And what I found was illuminating. Jason wasn't the untouchable titan of industry he pretended to be. His business was a house of cards, built on a foundation of bad debt and questionable partnerships. He had skeletons in his closet, skeletons I knew how to use. I didn't confront him. Not yet. That would come later. For now, I held on to the information, a trump card I would play when the moment was right. As the weeks passed, I began to feel like myself again. Stronger, more confident, more in control. Elena may not have realized it yet, but the balance of power in our relationship was shifting. I was no longer the man who stood silently at the party, a target for their ridicule. I was becoming someone new. Someone who knew his worth, and who was not afraid to demand respect. And when the time came to show Elena and Jason what that looked like, I would be ready. Elena thought she was untouchable, a queen in her own self-created kingdom, but no one's life is as flawless as they project. As I rebuilt myself, finding a new, quiet strength, I started to notice the cracks in her carefully curated world. It began with small clues, inconsistencies in the narrative she presented to the world and to me. A late-night text that would light up her phone, which she would quickly dismiss. A conversation that would abruptly end the moment I walked into the room. It wasn't enough to form an accusation. but it was enough to fuel my own, now justified, curiosity. I started paying closer attention, not obsessively, but with the dispassionate focus of a man analyzing a case. Her social calendar, once a shared document, became more opaque. "I have to meet Sophia," she'd say, grabbing her purse. "Carla wants to go over ideas for the charity event." Always vague, always nonchalant. But when I'd cross-reference, a casual call to David, whose wife was close with Sophia, a brief chat with Carla's husband at the gym, the stories didn't always align. Sophia hadn't seen her in weeks. Carla hadn't spoken to her outside of the group chat. So, where was she going? And then there was Jason. I hadn't seen him since our tense encounter at the coffee shop, but his name was a ghost that still haunted our social circle, a recurring character in the stories Elena would tell about her day. It was always subtle, but it was there. Asterisk, Jason thinks. Jason said. Jason's planning. Asterisk, he was inserting himself into the cracks of our marriage, and Elena was holding the door open for him. So, I started digging. Not out of paranoia, but out of a need for self-preservation. If Elena was choosing to align herself with a man like Jason, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. And what I found was both illuminating and deeply satisfying. Jason's perfect golden boy facade was just that, a facade. Behind the charm and the expensive suits, he was a man drowning in financial trouble. Through a few discreet inquiries with a contact in the financial world, I learned he had been quietly ousted from 2 previous business partnerships for what was euphemistically termed irreconcilable differences, corporate speak for he can't be trusted. He was living on borrowed time, his lifestyle a precarious illusion funded by high-interest loans and the goodwill of people he would eventually burn. But that wasn't all. An old college friend of his, a man I hadn't spoken to in years but who had heard about the party through the grapevine, reached out to me. "Watch your back with Jason," he'd said. "He has a thing for married women. He likes the game. He likes to stir the pot and see what happens." I wasn't surprised, but it confirmed my suspicions. Jason wasn't just a smug opportunist. He was a predator, an emotional arsonist who got a thrill from watching other people's lives burn. And Elena, whether she knew it or not, was his latest source of fuel. I kept the information to myself, letting it simmer. Meanwhile, I continued on my own path of reconstruction. I wasn't reacting to her anymore. I was acting for myself. And it was driving her crazy. "You've been so distant lately," she said one night, her voice laced with an unfamiliar note of irritation. "You barely talk to me." I raised an eyebrow. "Funny," I replied. "I could say the same about you." Her cheeks flushed. "Are you still mad about the party?" "I told you, it didn't mean anything." "This isn't about the party anymore, Elena," I said, my voice calm. "Even. This is about respect. And for a long time now, I haven't felt any from you." She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. "And don't tell me I'm being sensitive. You know as well as I do that things haven't been right between us for a long time. I'm just the first one willing to say it out loud." Her lips pressed into a thin, white line. For once, she had no quick comeback. Good. Let her sit with it. Over the next few weeks, I began to subtly deploy the intelligence I had gathered. I'd mention Jason's business troubles in passing, a piece of casual gossip I'd heard, and watch her face carefully for a reaction. I'd bring up the chatter from our friend's circle, always framing it as a neutral observation, but steering the conversation back to the events of that night. And slowly, the cracks began to appear in her own armor. I could see it in her eyes. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was fear. Fear that I knew more than I was letting on. Fear that her carefully controlled narrative was slipping out of her grasp. And she was right. It was only a matter of time before I confronted her, before I laid all the cards on the table. But I wasn't going to be impulsive. Jason and Elena thought they were playing a game. They were about to find out that I was the one who was going to win it. By the time I decided to host a gathering at our home, I was no longer a man reacting to a crisis. I was a man executing a meticulously crafted plan. This wasn't about revenge, not in the hot-blooded, emotional sense. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my voice, and my power. For weeks, I had been patient, observing, preparing. Elena and Jason believed they held all the cards. They didn't realize I had been quietly, methodically, stacking the deck. The idea for the party came from Carla, of all people. "You guys should host something," she'd suggested. "You know, get everyone together again. Clear the air." I knew what she really meant. Give the piranhas another chance to feed. At first, I was resistant. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was the perfect stage. If they wanted to play their games, I would set the board. And this time, I would be in control. Elena was surprisingly enthusiastic. She dove into the planning with a manic energy, as if she believed this was her chance to reset the narrative, to erase the ugliness of that last party with a new, flawless performance. I let her take the lead. Her distraction gave me the space I needed to finalize my own preparations. I quietly reached out to a few key people, David, Carla's husband, and a few others I knew were more loyal to the truth than to Jason's charm. I planted the seeds. Asterisk, have you heard about Jason's business troubles? Crazy, right? He seems so successful. Asterisk, it was just casual gossip, but I knew it would spread. The night of the party, I was ready. The house was immaculate. Elena, in a sleek black dress, was the picture of the perfect hostess. I stood back, observing, waiting. Jason arrived, as I knew he would, walking in with that same smug, proprietary air. "Mark," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Good to see you, man. Thanks for the invite." I smiled, a calm, easy expression. "Of course, Jason. Wouldn't want you to miss it." The evening unfolded smoothly at first, but underneath the light-hearted chatter, a new tension was simmering. I could see it in the way Elena's eyes kept darting toward me, in the way Jason's confident smile didn't quite reach his eyes. They thought I was the same man they had humiliated weeks ago. They were wrong. My moment came when the group had gathered in the living room. Jason, predictably, was holding court, regaling everyone with an exaggerated story of a recent business triumph. When he finished, to a round of polite, obligatory chuckles, I saw my opening. "That's interesting, Jason," I said, my tone casual. "I'd heard things were a bit tough for you lately. Something about a bad investment." The room went silent. Jason's smile faltered. "Oh, you know how it is," he said, trying to brush it off. "Ups and downs. Part of the game." "True," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "But it must be stressful, especially with those lawsuits piling up. I imagine it's hard to focus on growth when you're busy putting out fires." His face hardened. I saw a flash of panic in Elena's eyes. She knew where this was going. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, Mark," Jason said, his voice tight. "Oh, I'm sure you don't," I said, a faint smile on my face. "But I'd be happy to fill you in later. Over drinks, maybe." The room was dead quiet. Jason tried to laugh it off, but the damage was done. His carefully constructed image had taken a direct hit. Later, Elena pulled me aside, her voice a furious whisper. "What are you doing? Why are you trying to embarrass him?" "I'm not trying, Elena," I said calmly. "I'm succeeding." Her eyes flashed with anger, but also with something else. Fear. For the first time, she wasn't in control of the situation, and she knew it. As the night wound down, Jason avoided me. The whispers followed him as he made his hasty exit. When the last guest was gone, I turned to Elena, my voice steady. "Now," I said, "we talk." She didn't argue. As we sat down in the now empty living room, I could feel the shift in the air. I was no longer the silent, humiliated husband. I had taken back my power, and it was time for Elena to finally see what that really meant. The living room, stripped of its party guests and forced gaiety, felt heavy, almost suffocating. Elena and I sat across from each other, the silence between us a chasm. She was perched stiffly on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes darting everywhere but at me. I leaned back in my armchair, calm on the surface, but inside, I was bracing for the final, inevitable storm. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a reckoning. "You've been quiet," I said finally, my voice breaking the tension. "I'm surprised. Usually, you're the life of the party." She flinched at the deliberate jab. "What do you want me to say, Mark? You've been acting like a completely different person. I don't even recognize you." A short, bitter laugh escaped my lips. "That's funny, coming from you. Do you even recognize yourself, Elena? Or has Jason's flattery blurred the lines so much you've forgotten who you are?" Her face flushed with a deep, mottled red. She opened her mouth to fire back a retort, but then, for the first time, she stopped. I saw something crack in her expression, a flicker of guilt, of genuine self-doubt. It was gone as quickly as it came, but I had seen it. She crossed her arms, her defensive posture returning. "This isn't about Jason," she said sharply. "This is about us. About how we've been drifting apart for years. You can't seriously think this is all my fault. I nodded slowly, letting her words hang in the air. You're right, I said, my voice even. It's not all your fault. But let's not pretend that you kissing another man in front of our friends was some desperate cry for help. That wasn't about us, Elena. That was about you. Her eyes widened, the anger boiling to the surface. I kissed him because I was angry, she snapped. Because you make me feel invisible, Mark. You bury yourself in your work, you go through the motions at home, and I'm just here. A piece of furniture. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to feel like you are screaming into a void every single day? Her voice cracked at the end, a raw, painful sound of genuine emotion. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, and locked my eyes with hers. I get it, I said quietly. You're angry. You feel ignored. And maybe I failed you in some ways. But none of that, not a single bit of it, justifies what you did. You humiliated me, Elena. You disrespected me, not just as your husband, but as a person. And the worst part? You didn't even seem to care. Her face softened, her defiance faltering. That's not true, she whispered. I didn't mean to hurt you. Didn't you? I countered, my voice steady but firm. You kissed him, knowing exactly how it would look. You called him a real man, knowing exactly how it would feel. And even after all of this, you haven't apologized. Not once. Not really. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Then let me make it simple, I said, leaning back again. Do you want this marriage to work? Do you still want to be my wife? Because if you do, it is going to take a hell of a lot more than excuses and avoidance to fix this. The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. For the first time, Elena looked truly, completely vulnerable. I do, she said softly, her voice trembling. I want us to work, Mark. I do. But I don't know how. Her admission surprised me, but I didn't let it show. It starts with honesty, I said. No more lies, no more games. I need to know the truth, Elena. About everything. About Jason. About us. About what you really want. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. For a moment, I thought her pride would win out. But then she looked up, and I saw something I hadn't seen in a very long time. The raw, unguarded woman I had fallen in love with. Jason was a distraction, she admitted, her voice shaking. He made me feel wanted, and I let it go too far. But it wasn't real, Mark. It was never real. I know that now. And what about us? I asked. Is there anything real left here? Or have we just been running on fumes? Her tears finally spilled over. She shook her head. I feel everything for you, she said, her voice breaking. That's the problem. I've been so afraid of losing you that I pushed you away instead. And now I don't know if I even deserve another chance. Her words, so raw and honest, began to chip away at the wall of anger I had built around my heart. I can't promise this will be easy, I said finally. And I can't promise I'll ever forget what you did. But if you are willing to put in the work, then so am I. That is the only way we move forward. She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I'll do whatever it takes, she said quietly. I just want us back. The conversation ended with no easy resolution. But for the first time in weeks, it felt like we were standing on the same side of the battlefield. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The conversation with Elena was a turning point, but it was not a magic wand. The wounds were still fresh, the trust still shattered. And Jason was a loose, and I was not willing to leave untied. If Elena wanted to rebuild our marriage, she would have to accept that I was no longer the man who would stand by silently while others disrespected me. Jason needed to learn a lesson in consequences. The pieces of his downfall were already in place. His charm was a mask, hiding a web of debt, manipulation, and burned bridges. His confidence was a house of cards, and I intended to be the gust of wind that brought it all down. I started small, planting seeds. I used David, our mutual friend who moved in Jason's professional circles, as an unwitting conduit. Did you hear about the lawsuit Jason's dealing with? I'd say over a casual lunch. Something about unpaid debts. Sounds messy. David, a man who loved gossip as much as he loved a good stock tip, took the bait. I knew the information would spread. The real opportunity came at another charity gala. I knew Jason would be there, playing the part of the successful, charming bachelor. Elena, hesitant but determined to prove her commitment to us, agreed to go with me. She had no idea what I had planned. When we arrived, Jason was in his element, holding court by the bar. This time, I didn't avoid him. I walked right up to him, a polite, neutral smile on my face. "Jason," I said. He turned, his own smile faltering for a split second. "Mark, good to see you." "You too," I replied smoothly. "I see you're still working the room. It's impressive, really, the way you've built this whole image. Successful, charming, untouchable, especially considering how messy things are behind the scenes." His grin froze. "I'm not sure what you're getting at." "Oh, I think you are," I said, leaning in slightly. "The lawsuits, the debts, the businesses you've run into the ground. It's all very illuminating." His face darkened. "You're out of line." "No, Jason," I said, my voice dropping. "You were out of line the moment you decided to humiliate me in my own home. Did you really think I would just let that slide?" Before he could respond, I turned to the small group of people nearby, David among them, who had been watching our tense exchange. "Everyone," I said, my voice loud and cheerful. "I was just telling Jason how impressive it is that he manages to keep up appearances despite all the challenges he's been facing lately." A murmur went through the group. David seized the opportunity. "Challenges, Mark? What are you talking about?" "Oh, just some tough breaks," I said, my voice dripping with false sympathy. "Lawsuits, unpaid debts, investors pulling out. You know how it is. It's a tough world out there." The color drained from Jason's face. The whispers spread like wildfire. He tried to stammer out a denial, but it was too late. The carefully constructed image he had spent years building was cracking, right there, in front of everyone. I didn't stick around to watch him squirm. I stepped away, leaving him to the circling sharks. Elena caught up with me, her face pale. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice a mixture of shock and something else. "Aw?" "I showed him what happens when you cross a line, Elena," I replied. "He's not as untouchable as he thinks." The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. A thoughtful, introspective quiet. When we got home, Elena and I finally sat down, not as adversaries, but as two people trying to navigate the wreckage. "That's not the Mark I know," she said softly. "Maybe the Mark you know isn't the one I need to be anymore," I replied. She nodded slowly, a new understanding in her eyes. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about Jason. It was about us. It was about me finding my strength and her learning to respect it. In the weeks and months that followed, we began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were still arguments, still moments of doubt. We went to therapy. We learned to communicate, to be honest, to be vulnerable. And slowly, cautiously, we began to find our way back to each other. Jason's world continued to unravel. The rumors I had started took root, and his house of cards came tumbling down. He lost his business, his friends, his reputation. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale. Our marriage wasn't the same as it was before. It couldn't be. But in a way, it was stronger. It was built not on illusions, but on the hard, painful, and ultimately beautiful truth of who we really were. We were not a perfect couple, but we were real. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like more than enough.